record on this computer. And I will put the screen up. Oh, where's it gone? Right, can you see that? God damn it.
Are we still in the practice session?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start the webinar now and let people come in.
Great.
Do I just start it and everybody comes in?
Yeah, you need to put the play from start on the slides though, so you can't see.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a minute while more of you join in. As you can see, more people are joining by the second, so we will begin in one minute. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to tonight's Special Needs Jungle webinar about the SEND Improvement Plan, hosted by me, Tania Tirraoro, and my co-director at Special Needs Jungle, Renata Blower. And we have a really exciting lineup for you with our experts, and we'll introduce them all in just a moment.
Okay, but first, as we wait for everyone to settle in, you should see on your screen in a moment a short poll about your understanding of the plan at the current moment. So please take a moment when it comes up to vote on two questions. The first question is how much you currently understand the SEND implementation plan. And secondly, from what you do understand, does the plan have the potential to improve SEND provision and reduce the need for appeals? Just give you a moment to vote. Okay, so at the moment we can see from the do you understand the SEND implementation plan, somewhat is coming out quite far ahead. We've only got 5% who are saying yes, definitely, 19% who say not at all. And our other question, whether or not it has the potential to improve SEND provision and reduce the need for appeals, we've only got 1% who think yes, definitely, 9% who think yes, maybe, and I'm not yet sure, 56%, and no, definitely not at 34%. I don't think there's any particular surprises there for anyone. Now, you will have a chance to ask questions and they'll be answered for the last half hour. The chat is open for you to make comments, but if you have a question rather than a comment, please add it in the Q&A section only, because if you put it in the chat, we won't see it, and so it won't get answered.
Okay, so before we begin, we've got a few little slides here, and I'm just going to have to try to share my screen. Let's go back here. I will close this down. I will share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see that. So that's us. Hello. So really, it's called a change program, the Send Improvement Plan. There is no change to Send legal entitlements, which means no change to HCP assessment criteria, no change to rights of appeal, no change to mediation, even if you're involved in a change program pilot, which I'm sure we'll touch on later on. And if you are told otherwise, please challenge them.
Right, the next two slides are just a summary of the key points. There are a lot, so we're not going to bother reading them out to you because we don't have time, but we will upload a PDF copy for you when we publish the recording. So don't worry about writing any of it down, you will get a copy. You can see that the plans such as mandatory mediation and tailored lists that parents absolutely did not want are still in there. And they're going to be tested in a non-statutory way. And we'll talk about that more in the session. Some things like the Ofsted inspections are underway already. If you participated in one, email us to tell us your thoughts because we're really interested to know how they're going. Most of the plans are just about testing things out. There is a lot of engagement ahead, so watch out for that too. And obviously we will let you know of any that we come across.
Okay, so we're back in vision. So let's meet our panel who are patiently waiting here and ask them to introduce themselves. So we'll start by SNJ's very own funding and accountability expert and Send parent, Matt Keer.
Hi there. Sorry, do you just need a background of who I am, or? Yeah, so I'm Matt. I'm a parent to two profoundly deaf young men who have now, as of last summer, both left the Send system, and I write columns from time to time on statistics, on funding, on accountability for SNJ.
Thanks, Matt. And now our legal columnist, Send lawyer, Hayley Mason.
Good evening, everybody. Most of you will be familiar with me. I am a qualified solicitor, senior solicitor and director at SEN Legal. I also write as SNJ's legal columnist. So if there are any particular issues you want to be covered on SNJ, please do let Tania and Renata know, and I will cover any points that you feel would be helpful to pop up on the website for them.
Thank you, Hayley. And now on to your esteemed legal colleague, public law barrister Steve Broach.
Good evening all, very pleased to be here to add tuppence to the discussion about the implications of the Send plan for the law and legally related issues. There's no direct changes, as Tania says, but I do think there has some important implications that need to be considered.
Thanks, Steve. And last but never least, Send parent, advocate and PhD researcher, Sharon Smith.
Thanks, Renata, and thank you for inviting me. So I am a parent of an 18-year-old daughter who has Down syndrome. And as Renata said, I'm also undertaking a PhD. I'm in the final stages of doctoral research around education and inclusion of disabled children. And I've been undertaking that research with parents with Down syndrome. I was also involved in the Pathfinder reforms as a parent care representative, and it does feel like we're going through similar processes again here. In addition to those various hats, I do freelance work and for charities, and I'm also a volunteer for a number of charities in the SEND sector too. So thank you.
And Sharon also writes for us as well.
We do, yes.
Yeah.
Mainly around Down syndrome and co-production and various other bits.
Fantastic. So in the same order, starting with Matt, now you've already written some thoughts on the plan for us, but you have now up to 3 minutes to offer your reaction to the Great Send transformation.
Not very transformative, is it? And I suppose the immediate thing is just you'll be hearing an awful lot over the next couple of years about how we're at the start of the journey, and I don't think any of us really are at the start of any journey. Sharon mentioned the Pathfinder program that preceded the 2014 SEND reforms, and it feels like we are now back pretty much to 2011. So there'll be a host of moderately funded pilot schemes. There are proposals. We have at least some sense of how the proposals will be sequenced. But by the time the core standards, the core piece of these changes get even halfway to fully embedded, it'll be 2025. There may well be a new government in place by then. The opposition certainly aren't committing to anything substantive at this stage. And by the time we get to the end of 2025, it will have been over 6 years since this review process started, longer than World War II, longer than the birth of the NHS, longer than the creation of the second Stone Roses album, if you can remember that back that far. So most of all the other panelists are going to have worthwhile stuff to say about some of the substance. I thought I'd comment on some of the things that are already happening that will change things, and that will be, I suspect, in the spirit of the changes to come. And first of those is, as Renata mentioned, the Ofsted CQC area SEND inspections have started with a slightly different focus and a slightly threshold. What is witness and strength services. But one really important thing, and I'm the finance guy, so I get to boss this one a bit, will be the programs of financial intervention that the Department for Education has underway. Those currently sit at 14 formal safety valve bailout agreements. We're expecting another 19. There are 54 other local authorities who are getting a light tickling from public finance accountants and associated consultants. I suspect that over the next 2 years is how many of the changes are being driven, and most people are going to be slightly concerned about the prospect for reduction in access to HCPs and how a local authority will balance its statutory obligations, which are thus far still unchanged, with the fairly acute financial accountability requirements that these agreements require. The only other thing I'd say in general terms about the plan is, yet again, practically all the references or the use of verbs with parent carers tend to be fairly emotive. We feel, we're anxious, we have confidence, or we don't have confidence. The bit of the plan I looked at in detail, 80% of parents reacted or were treated as largely emotional objects. And whilst that's not necessarily a bad thing, in other contexts, I suspect here it still really is not a good way to go about things. The problem is not necessarily what we feel or what we believe or our degree of confidence. It's in the sound functioning of a system underpinned by law that's more often than not disregarded. So that's my pen.
That's great, Matt. Thank you. And Hayley, your 3 minutes are next.
I'll try, Renata. Steve and I, I'm sure, will talk about some of this the same. Obviously, we're looking at it from lawyer perspective and what is legal and what is not. This is not law. It doesn't change anything. And I think that's something that I would really like to stress, because it has the potential to substantially confuse parents, I think, as different elements of it are brought in and tested, as to speak. And particularly for those parents that are new or navigating the system for the first time, that I know that when I go up and down the country speaking to parents, they often turn to local authority caseworkers or schools for their source of information, as rightly they would do. And I think where they're trying and testing some of these things, there might lead to some misunderstanding about what parents can ask for, particularly if they're trialing some of these schools lists in particular areas, for example. In my view, the improvement plan has a lot of buzzwords and aspirational aims, with the primary aim underpinning the improvement plan being focused on saving money and reducing the number of EHC plans. It comes up short on how they intend to do a lot of these things. And we know that the main meat of anything that's going to happen here has been kicked into 2025. Lots of the things that the improvement plan proposes, from my perspective, we already have. It is very clearly set out in the law, in the legislation, in the Children and Families Act and the SEND regulations. Central to the improvement plan is the introduction of these national standards, and these, they claim, are new standards for how children and young persons' needs are going to be identified and met, with lots of discussion about how this will ensure consistent processes which will be available. And all it sounds like to me is trying to put square pegs into round holes, those little toys that children play with. It feels like we are moving away from a focus on an individual child's needs and instead just looking at what is available for everybody in the local area, which is doing a huge disservice to the children and young people that really require this support. And accountability measures should have been the focus in this implementation plan. It is not, as this would have improved the system for children, young people and their families, which they've missed the mark on. Instead, they're moving away from individual needs of the child and instead focus on these new national standards, which we already have set out very clearly in law and which we will obviously do everything that we can to keep. Much that Matt touched on as well, I don't think anything's going to change anytime quick. I'd like to really make it clear to parents listening today that none of this is changing in the law. Certainly, we know nothing will be coming in until at least 2025. We will have a general election by then, and any changes to the law are some way off. So make sure that if you're being told any differently, you know where to go to challenge that information. But it's just disappointing for the parents who thought we were going to get something positive out of the SEND review, which was now 3.5 years ago, and we are still waiting for answers to that SEND review.
Thank you, Hayley. That was almost exactly 3 minutes. Well done. Steve, you've got 3 minutes, and Steve's going to be sharing his screen during his 3 minutes. Away you go.
Let's see how the tech works. Thanks very much. I'm going to echo much of what Hayley said, as she foretold. The first thing that I thought or felt, because it's all about feelings, isn't it, as Matt said, on reading the implementation plan, was really have heard some of this before, haven't we? And from Stephen Kingdom, who is the chair of the campaign manager for the Disabled Children's Partnership, was many parent carers might be saying, is that it? It was really very similar to my reaction as well. After all this time, really it's a collection of measures, some of which welcome, some of which aren't, but none of which I think have the potential to transform the experience of families, either individually or collectively, unfortunately. Not just the partners, but if you're really old, you might remember this. And you remember the Lamb inquiry? The report of the Lamb inquiry into special educational needs and conference 2009. That little girl looking up slightly alarmingly at her teacher or TA is now in her 20s. She was 7, I think, there. And yet everything in the Lamb inquiry is again in the implementation plan in some form or another, or not put perhaps in such a child-centered way as it was here. We see the focus in those days was children's outcomes at the heart of the system. A stronger voice of parents, a system with a greater focus on children's needs, and there's a whole chapter on this, of course, in the implementation plan, a more accountable system that delivers better services. So if anything, I would suggest that the implementation plan is less than what we had back in 2009 in terms of an agenda for change. And certainly the focus on the individualized needs of children has absolutely disappeared in favor of standardization and these national standards, which do worry me, and they worry me from a legal perspective. I'm just going to try and see if I can shift across. Hopefully, if I just go like that, you'll now see the implementation plan. Is that working for everyone? Because this is the key section I've picked out to flag up in my 3 minutes. What are these national standards going to be? It's said that they will clarify what types of support should be made available based on the evidence of what works. Well, the answer to that in law is the type of support that meets the child's needs. whose job is it to make different types of provision available? Is the government aware of the contents of Section 42 of the Children and Families Act? It expressly states it's the local authority's job to secure all the special educational provision, and the responsible commissioning body's job to secure all the health provision. And the social care provision is supposed to come from the local authority as well. So why do we need national standards for that? Which budget should be used to pay for support? Okay, fair enough. But from a user perspective, who cares? That's not transformatory. It's just making sure that the right bit of state funding is used to meet needs. So it really does matter what these standards say if they are going to have any kind of significance, because the tests in law for an EHC needs assessment to be carried out or an EHC plan to be issued are all hooked to whether or not a plan may be or is required. And that can only be assessed by reference to what is going on without the plan. So it does matter, policy does matter legally here, because in a positive potential scenario, if there is better earlier provision under national standards, maybe less need for EHC plans. That may happen. But equally, what might happen is that the national standards state that certain things will be happening nationally, which then effectively raises the bar for an EHC plan to be issued. But in practice, these things may not happen. So
just a quick word, you're at 3 minutes, Steve.
I was about to stop. I definitely think that's the area that we need to have the most focus on as lawyers.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Comprehensive as always. And Sharon, it's your turn. 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll try and keep in with the 3 minutes as well. Well, I think from a parent's perspective, it's somewhat depressing. What we're seeing is another period of testing and refining reforms. And as I said before, it reminds me of Pathfinder reforms from 2011. We're seeing more implementation and change boards, probably with the same people sat around the same table that have been there for the last 12 years, if not before. More evidence gathering, as though there's not enough evidence of actually where the problems lie. And basically, as Hayley said, there is the real potential for a lot of confusion and misunderstanding over the coming months and years, despite the law not actually changing. So I think the promise of reforms to address the SEND crisis that is very real for families has simply not come to fruition. We're not seeing that transformation and the change that we need. So what we are seeing, as expected, is that cost is the major driver, reducing both choice and accountability, under maybe a cloak of equity. We're stopping these pushy parents getting more than their due with the delivery of these standard online EHCPs, national banding tariffs, national standards. And anyone would think that our children and young people were indeed standard, a homogenous group whose needs can be neatly packaged into distinct categories with a series of flowcharts and tick boxes, so that we can actually tick those off, removing all need for actual relationships or any expertise about what our children actually need. Children who maybe are a very complex and diverse group of pupils. In my response, I just want to add 2 other points, probably because I can't really comment too much on the law. I'm not qualified to do that. So co-production, again, we see co-production mentioned throughout both the Green Paper and also the Improvement Plan, but there's no discussion about what co-production is, or even whether co-production as it's currently being conceived is a good thing or not. There are tensions that exist when there are some parents who are engaged in strategic co-production at a local and national level, when the majority of parents still feel that they don't have any voice and they don't have any say about what's going on, and maybe that voice is also being reduced. The Green Paper did suggest that there would be some standards around co-production, but there's no mention of that in the Improvement Plan. But what we do see definitely in these proposals is that we seem to be moving further away from any idea of person-centred planning and that sort of greater choice and control for children and young people and their families. Instead, local authorities will be working hard to ascertain which box, band or type of school particular children fit in. And as we've said before, that's more likely to be supply-based than need-based. And the second thing that I just want to add very quickly before my time is up is just I'm really concerned, particularly for families of children who have Down syndrome. That's my area of interest and expertise, I guess. We had the Down Syndrome Act came into force in April 22. Which requires a production of guidance. And I think that there's a real risk that the combination of this Down syndrome guidance, which suggests that there are certain ways that children with Down syndrome should be educated and the best sort of provision, we're still waiting to see what that looks like, and the idea of national bans and national standards and different types of lists of schools for different types of children. I think there's a real risk that we could see some blanket policies being put in place for children with Down syndrome. I remember when my daughter was starting school, she got her first statement and her best friend also had Down syndrome, and our local authority issued 2 identical statements because of course 2 children with Down syndrome are going to have exactly the same needs, and I feel we're coming back to a similar scenario here. So again, I just want to say to those families who have children with Down syndrome, the law is not changing, and as we've heard Hayley and Steve saying, you know, your rights currently remain the same, whether the Down Syndrome Act guidance says one thing or the national standards say another, the law stayed the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, everybody. So I think we've got a pretty good overview now of what the experts think. So we've now got some general questions. And in a little while, we'll be putting the floor out open to you guys as well. So first of all, what aspects of this plan have the potential to transform SEND in a positive way? So I'd like to ask Matt first, and then when he's finished, if anybody else wants to chip in, just go for it.
I don't think anything that's here is going to transform. Frankly, I mean, I banged on at the time scale at the start, and I think that's crucial. The decline in the way the system operates has accelerated over the 3.5 years or so that we've been through this process, and it won't be static for the next 2 years either. A lot of the fundamental proposals, it is honestly too early to tell. There's an awful lot of what we'll do, but not necessarily how we'll do it, and there's a nod to tensions within the arrangements, but for an implementation plan, there's not a lot of how in it. There's not a lot of how you would resolve the tension, for example, between early intervention and meeting needs at the more complex end. So simple answer is I don't think there are positive things within this plan, but yeah, you know, I imagine you're going to hear a lot about digital EHCPs in the next in the next few minutes, but that, for me, that's not transformational. If you strip down and make the processes more lawful on a lawfully implemented, if you stop LAs from putting 84-page EHC best practice guides and policies locally, that sort of thing, you know, changing that and changing organization cultures, those are transformational. But as we see it here, there really isn't a lot that would transform. There are positive things, but they're nipping and tucking at the edges.
So anyone else on a positive transformation? Dive in.
The only positive, just very briefly, the only positive is that they're not making things worse. The proposed legal changes were, some of them were deeply concerning. Mandatory mediation as a gateway as a hoop to jump through before you can get to the tribunal, which will cause even more delays. The list of schools who might be choosing that list. Why do we need to fetter parent choice in that way? I know that they're all still lurking around, but at least none of it's happening anytime soon, and hopefully never. So I'll take not getting worse as my transformatory legal feature.
Anyone else on this, or shall we move on to the next question? Okay, Renata.
It's always
Oh,
worrying.
sorry,
isn't
and
it?
by the way, I think there might be a problem with the chat. I certainly haven't disabled it, but I don't know why it's not working. So apologies if it's not. I'm not quite sure what's happened, but it should be working. We'll just have to plod on if it's not. Sorry, Renata.
Okay, so it's kind of along the same themes, but this time you're allowed to say negative things. Can you pull out top positive and top negative part of the plan, please? Hayley first.
I'm not sure I can stick to one, Renata, but are we quick? Over one. So positives, EHCP format. So this is one of the only things that we lost when we moved across states. If people remember, when we went from statements to EHC plans, local authorities, somebody somewhere thought that would be a really good idea to give local authorities the power to form their own. And we've just ended up with obviously very varied ones across the country. It seems to be quite a positive change, but why it's going to take till 2025 to come up with a template is bizarre. What's going to take so long? And also there's no assurances that the template they create is going to be any good. That's something that I'm quite concerned about. It's helpful that everyone will be on the same one, but what's it going to look like? We don't know. Do you think generally it's quite positive? Funding for educational psychologists, I think, is quite positive in the scheme of things. We know that they're short across the country, and I think access to more educational psychologists is good news. And free schools, I think what I'd put with my third kind of positive thing. Certainly there is a shortage of schools in the country. I don't think anyone can deny that. And I think that if there is more resources targeted to building free schools and some parents have access to more specialist support in their local area, then obviously that is fantastic. How they're resourced, whether they're going to be resourced enough is obviously a completely different matter, but has the opportunity to be positive. Obviously, I have more negatives to say than positives. That's not because I'm a solicitor and we focus on the negatives. It's because that's what this improvement plan has put out. The national standards is a big concern for me, particularly. I think there is a common misconception painted throughout the improvement plan that there is this geographical variation in SEND and what's allowed to happen up and down the country. We do know that local authorities, particular local authorities, or some are better at applying the law than others, but largely I represent parents in different local authorities across England, and they're all about the same. You know, you get a couple of bad eggs, but essentially they all know what the law is and there's difficulty applying it across the board. It doesn't mean that it's allowed, and we have quite clearly got set out in the Children and Families Act and also in the SEND regulations what has to be provided. And the reason this concerns me is because it seems to me very unlikely that they intend to maintain the current thresholds and entitlements and processes, because otherwise we wouldn't need national standards, essentially. Because Steve touched on this earlier, when it mentions instructing on how and when an assessment should take place, we already have that in law quite clearly set out. Who and when should be involved. There's lots of these things and they haven't come through the improvement plan and nothing has changed, but these are things that particularly as lawyers we want to be focusing on because we wouldn't need them. It's clearly set out, and if they're bringing in or want to bring in national standards, explore national standards, then I think that we should be very cautious about that, because that is always about reducing legal entitlement, but we're certainly not going to see that anytime soon. The other two particularly negative things I think to focus on is a predetermined schools list. Again, we know that this is going to be tested up and down the country. I think it's particularly pertinent that in it says, in a specific page about the schools list, it says we should focus on individual child's needs, but we're going to determine where they go. So it's a very rogue statement that this is focusing on children and young people and what their needs require, but we are going to provide a predetermined list that we as your local authority has selected for you to send your child to. And I think that's a terrible, terrible idea. They are going to make specialist provision harder to access with the assumption that mainstream provision is going to fill the gaps, when we know in reality there are so many children and young person which will fall through those gaps, and they are going to be the ones suffering. And also, Steve touched on it as well, mandatory mediation is a big one that I think is a particularly negative. It's very worrying that so many people opposed it in the consultation responses, and yet they are still trying to push forward with the mandatory mediation. And it's particularly worth pointing out that the SEND mediation panel of the Civil Mediation Council and the College of Mediators also felt that mandatory mediation process was not appropriate, as did parents and children and young persons, and they are still trying to push forward with that. So 3 positives and 3 negatives, but hopefully covered them quickly for you guys.
Thanks. Who wants to go next? Sharon?
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm going to pick up on one of the points that Hayley said, and I'm actually going to use it as a positive and a negative. So I think there's 2 sides of the same coin, and that's inclusion. I think a greater focus on inclusion in mainstream education is a positive thing. I think anything that enables more children to go to school in their local area with their peers and to have a positive and enriching experience in that local school cannot be anything other than positive. But the negative is there's no detail at all in this improvement plan about how they are going to improve inclusion and children and young people's experiences in mainstream education. And I really worry that inclusion is being positioned here as a means to cut costs rather than...
Have they got a definition of inclusion?
Well,
it means a lot of different things.
It absolutely means a lot of different things, and I think, you know, it's a very contested concept, as I will be writing about in quite some depth. But I think, as I was saying, I think it's positioned here as a means to cut costs. It's not here as an end in itself. It's not an ideological position that this government has, that inclusion is what they are wanting. David Cameron in 2011 said they wanted to remove the bias towards inclusion, and they are still not really sort of stepping back on that. So this is about cutting costs. So as a result, I think that there is a real danger that lots of children are going to be pushed into mainstream settings with the list of schools and the national standards and the bandings and the funding and all of these different things. They're going to be pushed into mainstream education against their wishes and against their parents' wishes, potentially in unsuitable settings, and I just think it's going to lead to more challenging and negative experiences for those children. And I think actually, if we are to try to achieve more meaningful inclusion, there needs to be a significant investment in mainstream education, but also some really significant changes in just what our mainstream education looks like and what it stands for and what it's trying to achieve. So it's wholesale change to mainstream education, and I just, yeah, so although I think it's positive that there's a focus on inclusion, it's not even going anywhere near what we need it to look like.
Thanks, Sharon. Is there anyone else who has a burning desire to add to this?
Yeah, we've just lost Matt for a minute, but I'm sure Steve can
I'll fill in. Just riff for a bit. The thing that I was going to stress was the sort of missed opportunities point. I did a quick search coming in for Equality Act in the plan. There's one reference to it, which is about the Access to Work scheme. So this SEND improvement plan has nothing to say about the potentially transformative implications of the Equality Act duties on schools, and in particular the duty to make reasonable adjustments for disabled pupils, which seems to just be completely absent from this, as if the Equality Act is a totally separate silo for the government to think about, which it may be, but it shouldn't be, because of course the focus of the reasonable adjustments duty in particular is on precisely the point that's just being discussed by Sharon and Tania: meaningful inclusion, real tangible change in provision at a very granular level, grassroots level, for individual disabled children and young people. So I think the fact that there's nothing about the Equality Act in this plan is one of the most striking examples of it being a missed opportunity to actually transform anything.
Matt, did you jump in?
It's a bit left field, but some of the really dull-looking stuff about boards at the end. The whole of the SEND review and improvement process has taken place largely behind closed doors. There is going to be a implementation and delivery board, and it will be chaired by ministers, which I think is a good thing. And the plan talk about actually publishing things they do, which the last board chaired by one Tania McArdle simply failed to do. It was easier for me as a parent to find out what the North Korean Politburo was getting up on a month-to-month basis than it was to find out what McArdle's crew were doing. And I think generally that's a good thing, not just for awareness for people like us, but enabling MPs, councillors, and others to ask serious questions of senior people on a regular basis. So I think that's a good thing if it happens.
Great, thank you, Matt. So we know the DfE have had to adjust their plan because they've lost the legislative opportunity to change the law. But having seen the consultation analysis, do you think the DfE amended their plans at all as a result of what they heard in the consultation? Anybody? Let's say Sharon, you will know.
No, I don't think so. I think actually, as you've said, the reason that we're not seeing some of those bigger changes, you know, the things that Steve said are positive and not happen immediately, is because they don't have the opportunity to actually change the legislation. And we've got a general election coming up, which obviously potentially will change things too. So I think, you know, their plan all along is to reduce costs. We're still seeing that as a golden thread throughout these proposals. That has not changed. Ali Fiddy from IPSI has said that it seems unlikely that they want to maintain the current thresholds, entitlements and processes. And I think that remains the case, but it's just that they don't actually have the ability to change that in the timescales they wanted. So it just feels they're extending things out and probably hoping that they'll get elected in the next general election. But I did have some time today, and I actually spent quite a lot of time looking at the consultation analysis. And I think that it would be a great piece of work for Special Needs Jungle to look at. Maybe Matt could work his magic on it, but I'm also happy to have a look. I noted that they've counted responses from organisations such as those representing parent carers as just one response, rather than recognising, for instance, that an organisation like Special Needs Jungle might be representing hundreds of parents. So I think that they have undercounted how many parents have responded to this and how many people are actually against some of their proposals. And I think it's skewed their reporting in a way that's, I think, is disingenuous. So it makes it look like more people, a greater percentage, are actually in favour of some of their proposals. And I'm not sure who they're trying to persuade that parents actually are in agreement with what they're suggesting here. You know, whether it's that they're trying to persuade themselves that they're doing what parents want, or whether they're just trying to persuade local authorities that parents are also in agreement.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember when we did the consultation, it had things like agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly, which would have been like a good analysis tool, but it doesn't appear, as far as I'm aware, in that consultation response. And that is an interesting question as to why not. Absolutely.
I think there's lots of questions actually to be asked. And as I say, I think it would be really interesting for Special Needs Jungle to do a bit more work around that document. Sharon. So I'm more than happy to contribute to that.
Anyone else on that, the subject of the consultation and whether they've changed their plan?
I don't think they have either, Tania, to be honest. Just a quick look at it earlier on. Only 29% of consultation respondents felt the proposals set out in the Green Paper, such as the national standards and mandatory mediation, would strengthen redress. Yet that's focused on over half, 59% disagreed or strongly disagreed. And yet that's continuously through the improvement plan. The majority of respondents, people won't be surprised probably by this, from healthcare, local authorities and education settings agreed with the overall approach to strengthen redress, but a majority of parents or carers disagreed. And I think that's quite fundamental actually when we're on here talking to the amount of parents that we are this evening.
How are they weighting that as well?
Yeah. And these things were strongly disagreed or disagreed by parents, and that's what we're talking about in those boxes that we were voted on to vote on where we fell on those, and yet they're still through the improvement plan. So we've got this improvement plan, don't forget, that's designed for children and designed for young people, and bringing all of this, empathy for parents. We understand the system, and then they're voting strongly disagree, and we're going, oh yeah, we'll concentrate on those bits. That's fundamentally wrong about the plan. Similarly, mandatory mediation, the SEND mediation panel, there's a lovely bit that they put into their consultation response saying the panel is unanimously agreed the concept of mandatory mediation for parents in SEND mediation context is a step too far. It is generally a fundamental principle of the mediation process that a participant's engagement is on a voluntary basis. The current legislation makes the attendance of a representative from the local authority mandatory in certain circumstances, based on the fact that as a statutory body, there is a presumption of willingness to achieve resolution at the earliest opportunity. That parents, carers, young people have a choice as to engagement, and in some ways addresses the balance of power within the mediation. The fact that parents have chosen the voluntary mediation route is often welcomed by LA representatives, setting a tone of collaborative working from the start. So in actual fact, these mandatory mediation proposals that we're seeing is actually just going to, in my view, just add another hurdle to these parents trying to get to the SEND tribunal. And again, touching on the basis of there's quite clearly things that they wanted to include here. They haven't got the law to catch up with it. They can't get it through in time, but there are lots of things that they clearly wanted to put through. And even though parents have disagreed or strongly disagreed, they're still trying to put through.
As Katrina Moore said, they're trying to change the law without changing the law. Steve, Matt, your thoughts? Steve?
Not on the consultation, but on the changing the law without changing the law point. I do think it's very significant the amount of comment that's being made in the chat and on the Q&A about, for example, people behaving as if mediation is mandatory already. It's not surprising, I think, that if there are very strong proposals to change the law, and then a document published saying, well, we would quite like to change the law, but we're not going to yet, that there will be confusion. And that's why the very clear messaging from the charities and S&J is so important, to emphasize that the law hasn't changed. On the specific point about mandatory mediation, I think there's a really interesting legal question about whether that is a thing legally, whether you can mandate mediation. Certainly, mediation in the commercial context, where two ships have run into each other and you've got two massive businesses claiming against each other, makes perfect sense, because some sort of compromise is probably in everyone's interest. But why should, if you've got a child with a report that says they need 1 hour a week of speech and language therapy, why should you be asked to mediate and compromise that and have only 1 hour a month? Your child should get what they need. So I think it's conceptually very difficult to mediate in our area, because mediation implies compromise, and we shouldn't be compromising what children need. And if you are going to mediate, it should be because you think that you can reach a good agreement for your child with the local authority. And in my view, it may be that making people mediate is a breach of both Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The government won't be particularly interested in that, I don't think, but they might be more interested in the idea that it's a breach of the common law and the common law right of access to the court. And that's, I think, a question that will probably be answered relatively quickly if government does continue to pursue mandatory mediation.
Thank you. Matt, anything on this?
Yeah, so I suppose there's quite selective interpretation. But most proposals, given the range of stakeholders, parents, local authorities, schools, and so on, will have had mixed opinions. They'll have had mixed opinions from the consultation, and sometimes that's used as a reason not to take things through. For example, there was a proposal to tinker with school performance league tables in a way that would allow parents to see more easily whether a school was inclusive or not. That hasn't made it through, apparently because there was mixed views, and yet we've seen mandatory mediation and the tailored list make it through. If you're feeling optimistic, the fact that those have been kicked into 2025 and beyond, you could argue that some of the consultation feedback may have made the implementing team think it was a battle too far for the moment. Alternatively, it might simply be a decision taken above their heads. We don't know, and we may never know.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. So our next question is, come 2025, we may have a new government, but let's pretend for now we don't. What will SEND look like if the Department for Education puts everything into practice that they want to? Oh, sorry, Steve.
Thanks, Renata. I guessed it might be me. Not very different, even if this happened. As Matt says, the time frame for most of the significant changes is post 2025. On the national standards by 2025, we won't have national standards yet. There'll be a work in progress still. So this is why I think on its own terms, this document is not a transformation program. Mm-hmm. It doesn't purport to be. It's a program. It's a tinkering program, really. Even if it was done to its fullest extent, which we all know it won't be, because nothing the government seeks to do ever happens in exactly the way the government wants it to, any government. So in that fanciful scenario, it still won't be particularly transformative, I don't think.
And anyone else? What do you think SEND will look like in 2025 if the Department for Education gets everything to go its way?
I think potentially it's even more confusing than it is now, in a system that they try to set out to make things easier for parents to navigate in this really complex system, because what we're now going to have are these proposals that they're going to be trialing in different areas. And what I have a real concern about is I meet hundreds of parents, thousands probably, through SNJ and through various speaking events. And the horror stories we're already told, that what parents hear from people, is astounding. I think that the schools list is a prime example. If you're in an area where schools is being trialed and you are coming up to this for the first time, or you haven't, had the time to do your research, let's be honest, parents of children with special needs, disabilities, do not have any spare time to read around this area. They're warriors in and of themselves to find the time to access these kind of resources. Then what we need to see is, in those areas, if they're going to propose a list, and they've actually recognised this in the plan, because they specifically put in those areas the law isn't changing, because I think that even they realise it's going to cause confusion. Because if parents are given this predetermined list to trial it, do parents still know that they can still ask for any of the schools listed in Section 38 of the Children and Families Act? Well, who's going to be telling them that information? Or, as a parent who expects that the local authority who cares about your child and wants them to access the right support, if they're giving you a list, do you just think that that is what should be happening, and you don't know you have to challenge that, and you don't know that you've got a recourse to the SEND tribunal? So I think that as these things are trialled, by the time we get to 2025, the law wouldn't have changed. It's impossible to. People like Steve and I will be challenging every try and implementation of any change of the law, and lots of other lawyers doing the same to try and protect these children's rights. And I think that in the meantime, they've just caused mass confusion, because it's evident. I'm trying to reply to many people chat go through this evening. I've already replied to somebody who said one of the mediation companies is already telling them it's mandatory to go to mediation. Somebody's also saying they thought the schools list was already in. So this has been, I think, on like 2nd of March. We're like a couple of weeks in, if not that, and there's already confusion. And we're now going to have the next couple of years going through this. So I think that actually, unfortunately, we're going to be in a position where it's more frustrating for parents. It's even more confusing than it is now. Parents are still having out on their own to find access to these resources so that they know what the law is and they're being told of what their rights are. Because I still maintain this is one of the very clear areas of law that sets out exactly what children with special educational needs and disabilities have access to and require because of their individual needs. And this, we should keep honing on parents so that they are aware that whatever they're being told other than that is not accurate, because at the end of the day, parents have got a right of recourse to the SEND tribunal, and they still need to be aware of that, even if they're being presented with some trials that are going to be carried out through the country while there's such mass confusion. So keep reverting back to your good selves at SNJ to make sure they're clear about what they're entitled to. That's my real concern for parents.
There's also the
See in
concern,
the
I guess.
chat,
with the trials, that actually how to be gathering feedback about whether these are working for parents or not. Because if parents don't know that there's another option and they're just saying getting the list of schools, are they going to actually find out which ones would work better for parents? You know, how are they going to be assessing what works and what doesn't? And my concern is that it's going to be skewed. You know, by not giving people information, you then, you know, they won't necessarily know the better way.
I completely agree, Renata. And normally when the government wants to trial doing things differently, they relax obligations certain areas in order for things to be trialed. We may or may not agree with that, but at least then it's a meaningful trial because the law changed and you're doing things differently. All that this list does is add a layer of complexity on top of the statutory scheme. How would that be a useful trial to see if you change the law and have a defined list of schools, whether that's good or bad for children, young people and parents? I mean, the answer is bad. You don't need to trial that. But if that's something the government wants to look at, then they've either got to do it properly or not do it at all, I would
and also
say.
it does not just be in areas that are perhaps getting it better, you know, than others. We need actually the trials to be running in the areas that are getting it wrong. Because if they don't work there, then what's the point? There's no point trialing it in, you know, a local authority that is basically doing things that they should. Here's one. We need to know that the worst areas that this makes improvements. If not, why are we bothering?
Just saying, somebody's actually put in the chat here that an LA decision letter she saw today says that you have to attend mediation. So it is already happening, as Hayley's remarked.
Yeah,
Is there anyone else for this question?
Yeah, I just want to say I think it's been happening actually since the Green Paper. I deliver training and workshops to families and education, and there've been local authorities have actually been quoting the Green Paper and saying things have already changed, and that was before we've even had the improvement plan. And I think I just really want to agree with Hayley that we have got the potential here for a huge amount of confusion. So I think that in 2025, what we'll see is that special needs jungle and solicitors and entities like IPSI will be absolutely overwhelmed and exhausted, because I think that actually they're going to be needed more than ever. So,
Matt, have you? Yeah, so just following up a bit on what Steve said, I'd agree. You get to 2025 and the system, the way it operates, will still look roughly the same as it does now. I think what will have happened over the next 2 years is that the financial systems that are in place, which impose quite severe accountability on the LAs that sign up to it, will exert a fairly drastic effect. And you look into those agreements, and there are very precise key performance indicators about how many new EHCPs you're allowed, the net increase or decrease in the number of EHCPs, the number of plans that have to be ceased in order for the agreement still to function, the average spend on a specialist school placement. And whilst we are likely to still have the same standard accountability measures at the individual level, which, as we know, don't really function, these financials are going to exert pressure, severe pressure. And regardless of what's in the plan or not, in many of these LAs, it will become harder to get an EHC needs assessment. It will be harder to get particular types of specialist provision. It will be harder to avoid having your child or young person's plan ceased, because that's the agreement that local authorities in this position have signed up to. And that's all going to happen regardless of what's in the implementation plan or not. And for me, you get up to 2025, that's going to be the thing that will have made most difference. Thank you. Everybody's had a say for that one, but now we want to throw the questions over to the attendees. We've already got, I think there's 43 coming in there. So here is the first one. Do
LAs have more or less power with the new system to just place students in a school where the schools may struggle to meet needs? Who would like to start? Steve, you're a...
Saw Steve jumping for that one. Did you see him? He was like ready to go.
You're a lawyer, you could answer that. Well, obviously the point is that there is no new power to require schools to take children and young people under EHC plans. They don't need that to be a new power. They've got that already. And I think many local authorities are unfamiliar, it appears, with the fact that they can already require almost every school, any of the Section 38 schools, to take a child through naming that school in Section I of an EHC plan. And a number of times local authorities have said, in cases I'm involved in, oh, but we'd have to consult the school, and they might say no. To which we say, well, if they say no, you can name it anyway. It's up to you. It's your legal duty. It's your judgment that matters. Of course, you should ask the schools what they think, but ultimately it's for the local authority to decide whether or not the very narrow exceptions, for example, to the right to mainstream education are down. And if the local authority goes with what the school says, the tribunal may well not do so, because that's something, again, where the tribunal has the power to stand in the local authority's shoes. So it's another area which I think exemplifies the theme of this discussion, which is about confusion, about what the law already might say and what legal changes would be needed, never mind desirable. Local authorities already have this power. Whether I think there was some discussion about whether they would get powers in relation to children who don't have EHC plans. Obviously, that's not going to happen if it was in the pipeline, because there's no legal changes at all. But that's the only area where there may have been something that may have been up the minister's sleeve, but isn't going to happen as far as I understand.
Hayley, I'm sure you would like to chip in here.
Again, it's just that misconception already being played out. So authorities do, as Steve said, have the power to name all of the Section 38 schools in an EHC plan. Again, lots of confusion to parents who, with this consultation, might come back from the school and say one of the exceptions have been met. But again, it's up to the local authority to reduce evidence to show that one of those exceptions have been made out, and it's the local authority's duty to find a suitable school for the child. I know often that gets pushed back on the parent, but the local authority has to ensure that the school named in Section I of an EHC plan can meet the child's needs in Section B and deliver the provision in Section F. This doesn't change anything for local authorities. They've already got the power to do that. It's quite clearly set out in law, and this doesn't change anything further.
Is there anyone else who wants to answer that question, or should we go on to the next one? Right, let's go on to the next one. So this question is, will the law still trump the standards if you can argue that set standards are insufficient to meet the child's needs? Does anyone want to go first?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, the law will always trump the national standards. We don't know what they are, for starters, and the law will always trump standards. The law will always trump policy. The law will always trump code of practice. And we see this time and time again, and often a big source of confusion of the parents, where you have local authorities employing certain policies to make decisions in their particular area. And then parents will go to the tribunal to challenge those decisions. And again, those decisions are upheld. And I think this is quite important, because there does seem to be a running theme through the improvement plan about how we need to make this system less adversarial. And it kind of paints this picture of all of these parents turning up at court with all of these lawyers and fighting their case, and these pushy parents. In actual fact, the majority of parents, overwhelmingly so, go to the tribunal unrepresented and still win against local authorities. And I think that is really something that's not unpicked in the improvement plan. And the reason they're able to do so is because the tribunal applies the law. The legal framework is quite clearly set out. And if the local authorities are making policy decisions or just not applying the law correctly, when they go to the tribunal will only apply the law. They will look at the evidence available and they will apply the law. So this focus on the fact that parents are making the system adversarial, again, we go back to that accountability issue. If local authorities were correctly applying the law and there was accountability for that, we wouldn't see the amount of tribunal cases that we've got at the moment. The reason we're seeing an increase every single year on parents going to tribunal is because people like ourselves are hopefully getting the message out there to parents that you can challenge this decision. This isn't law, this is policy, take it to the tribunal. They will put it in place, and they are. It's, Matt will probably know the up-to-date figures, but it's something like 90%, maybe more than that, go in favour of parents at the Send Tribunal.
96.
And 96, exactly. And those largely are unrepresented. So I think that it's really important to stress that to parents, that actually we're getting the information out there, what's law, what's not, and parents are using those rights to go to the tribunal, and so they should, because we are talking about children and young people here with special educational needs and disability. This isn't a transaction between companies or a buyout or anything like that. This is fundamental needs that a child requires because of their very specific needs. That shouldn't be belittled in any way, and parents should continue to enforce those rights.
But we also see that local authorities are trying to convince the government, local authority leaders, that the tribunal is on the side of parents. So, you know, it's just really important to emphasize what you just said there, Hayley, that they apply the law impartially.
That's certainly my experience, Tania. I think the tribunal is on the side of the law. It doesn't feel to me, when I represent anyone in the tribunal, that the tribunal is on anyone's side, other than on the side of getting the right legal outcome in that particular case. I agree with what Hayley said, but I would add a caveat, which is a theme that I keep coming back to, which is that a lot of the law in this area is relative. So the duties are not absolute in the sense of, you know, if you have a particular diagnosis or you have a particular level of need, you will get X or Y. Quite rightly, what you get in our system, our social welfare system, is usually dependent on an assessment of your needs. And then you test the outcome of that assessment against some special standards. And the standard here is, what do mainstream schools nationally normally do in very broad terms? Now, if you have these new national standards that say, well, mainstream schools nationally will do X and Y, and then they don't do that, that is going to cause a problem, because the tribunal has to ask itself on appeal, what is the general position in this area? So I wonder if that's really what national standards are about, is about setting a much higher benchmark in terms of expectations for mainstream schools, without changing necessarily any funding or any law around supporting them to actually do that, but saying, well, we're not going to have as many EHC plans because, look, we've said that the mainstream system should be much more inclusive, and here are the standards that you can expect from that system. The big question will be, well, what do you do if those standards aren't met?
That was what I was going to say. Who does that fall to? Because if you've got general standards that are available to everybody and they're not delivered, Steve, are we going to extension to local government ombudsman to deal with that? Who's going to deal with that?
It's going to be chaos.
Extremely rare for a child to have one particular type of need, and it may be the secondary need that meeting that it's at dispute in. I mean, it certainly has been in cases that I've assisted around the edges. Essentially, you're trying to standardize systems around a group of children who largely defy standardization.
Thanks, man. We've lost Sharon for a minute now. I'm sure she'll be popping back, hopefully. So another parental question here. It says, seems from the conversation so far that the efforts and thinking actions in the plan are being pointed in the wrong direction. What do the experts think should be happening in the plan to create change as a result of the SEND review, or just in general? Sharon, should we go to you? Oh, she's gone again. So Matt.
What most people, I think, who think the way we do would argue the problems have been in implementation and in accountability, and there wasn't a great deal that needed to change with the structure. And you know, we come back to that. It's a system that the reason that it's seen as being in crisis by strategic decision makers is now because it costing too much on an unpredictable basis. So given a choice, I'd take a time machine, go back 5 years and focus on better implementation. And you get nuggets of that thinking within within the plan. I mean, it made me wonder if I'd maybe sniffed too much glue when I read that the DFM to see if to do a full evaluation of whether statutory duty is being met or not, and it's pretty difficult to read that and wonder why that hasn't happened in a review that's taken this long already, never mind a set of reforms which is for 8.5 years. But that's where I would come to it.
Sharon, while you're here, did you hear the question? Okay, can you?
No, sorry, my internet went down quickly. So no, if you could quickly repeat it.
What do the experts think should be happening in the plan to create positive change?
I
mean, perhaps,
I think there has to be better accountability. I don't know if you can still hear me. I think the accountability issue hasn't been addressed. That needs to be addressed, so people actually following the law that we have now. I would actually really like to see a greater emphasis on making mainstream schools more inclusive, and maybe that would result in fewer EHCPs over time. But I think that it should be that the goal is to make schools more inclusive and welcoming, rather than the goal to be reducing EHCPs, because I think actually to be inclusive, it may well be that that child needs an EHCP to be in a mainstream school. So I think that we're looking at the wrong measures. And I also just think that greater investment and training, and looking at the whole education system rather than just focusing on this group of children. So I think there needs to be more, as I said before earlier, sort of more whole-scale change in the education system to actually address these issues. I think that we're just putting sticking plasters on when we only look at what we're doing for this cohort of children rather than looking at the whole picture.
Because what's good for children with SEND is good for all children.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that there's a real problem when we just start sort of grouping out, and we've got this policy, then we're going to have the Down Syndrome Act, and we've got policies around dyslexia and autism, and then there's just going to be all this guidance, and I think what will happen is people will become completely overwhelmed with it and not really know, practitioners on the ground aren't going to know which guidance or what they're meant to be following. So I think, we need to be almost starting again and keeping the existing legislation, but actually looking at what can we do to change mainstream education whilst also having this sort of specialist expertise available too.
Because it does seem that children in mainstream are suffering, themselves, let alone, children with SEND. Hayley, what's your view?
Sorry, Tania, you'll have to give me, because I was engrossed in the questions, trying to get through some on there.
It seems to pick up on what Sharon was saying, is that children in mainstream, particularly post-pandemic, are having a narrowing of curriculum and so on, are having their own difficulties. So what would you say that could, I guess, not only just change children with SEND's experience, but all children as well, so that we are truly inclusive?
And I think my views are the same as Sharon's on that. The more children that can go into mainstream environment, absolutely fantastic. I think that certainly local authorities having schools in their local area that can meet children's needs is great, but not every child, not even 2 children with autism are the same, 2 children with Down syndrome, 2 children with any needs are the same. Some children have multiple diagnoses, so we'll straddle different areas. And this is what we've got a lot of at the moment. We're seeing schools that are built for specific needs and children not fitting into one mould or another and falling through the gaps. So I think that, yes, we should certainly encourage children to go into mainstream schools, but that is going to require a general cultural change. That's going to require more training of staff, because children going into mainstream schools have to have proper staffing. That's health and safety concerns around that as well. We know from the poll that we put out on SNJ, where we were asking how much training is local authority caseworkers given, how much training is school staff given. We know there is nowhere near enough training in this area, and that's something that would definitely have to be improved for more disabled children to be going into mainstream environments. Similarly, just the money going into these schools to support these children, and also just the genuine cultural change, because it's fundamentally sad, but we know fundamentally going on in all of the schools, lots of children who are different are bullied. And we are not expecting to send children into schools without a genuine change who are going to get bullied because they're different to other children. So this is not a quick fix. Yes, it would be great to see it happen. And I will always advocate for children to be going in where their needs are met, but that must be fundamental here. Their needs have to be met, and you can't just push children into mainstream schools to save money and let them and their family suffer the consequences, because that is not fair.
Stephen.
I agree with the concerns that are being expressed about the motivation for the government's apparent conversion in favour of mainstream education. It does seem to be rather closely aligned to their desperate worry about the amount of money that this is all costing. And that isn't, I agree, the right approach. I did a quick search again in the plan for another word that one might expect to see in a plan like this, which is the word rights. And the mention of the word rights in the plan is paragraph 66, which is the reassurance that in the areas where they're going to be testing various things, there'll be no change to the statutory framework, and parents and young people's existing rights will be unaffected. So it's that in that very narrow sense. There's no mention of children's human rights. There's no mention of the human right to education under the Human Rights Act, and certainly no mention of the right to meaningful inclusion in Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so, to go back to that original question, what would you do differently? I'd start from a rights analysis. I'd start from the position that what we are trying to design is a system that ensures that every child gets their right to education, and that the CRPD is implemented in full. And I'd ask, what would that look like, as opposed to a system which is designed to well, at least in one of its key objectives in the plan is to save money. And that is inconsistent, in my view, with any cost analysis.
Okay, and moving on to our next question. This is one that got quite a lot of votes in the Q&A, and it's around the threshold, the change in thresholds for diagnosis and assessments. So the question is, if some ICBs, which, if anyone doesn't know, stands for Integrated Care Boards, are already changing the eligibility criteria for assessment to be much, much narrower, aren't they already making it harder, not easier, for parents to get help for their children? Is what the ICBs are doing even lawful? Anyone want to jump in on this one, or shall I just pick?
It's not a question that I can comment on.
Okay. Hayley, have you got any thoughts?
Sorry, Renata, again, I was trying to answer as many questions as I possibly could, and the track says so many.
The concern is that ICBs are narrowing the threshold for assessment and diagnosis for things like autism. So therefore it's getting harder for parents to get help, because obviously getting a diagnosis or even getting on the assessment pathway is now more difficult. And the question is what the ICBs are doing by narrowing these thresholds lawful?
That's not particularly something I would say, but what I would say is you don't even need a diagnosis. I think that's quite important for parents to know. You have to set out your child's special educational needs. That doesn't mean you have a diagnosis. You can still have a detailed description of what your child is struggling with. The school can still provide information around that. So if parents are struggling specifically with getting a diagnosis, then they can still apply for an EHC needs assessment. There's nothing to say that a diagnosis is required, and they should go through the SEN application on the way, just type in EHC needs assessment and apply, because if they are seeing difficulties and they are requiring provision over and above that's being provided, then I would suggest that they go and apply. There isn't any need for a diagnosis. I can't comment on specific ICBs because I don't know what's going on in that particular area, but I would just say that a diagnosis is not required in order to get an EHC EHC plan or an EHC needs assessment. So if parents are being put off applying for that reason, then they can simply make the application regardless of any diagnoses, and obviously similarly go through GPs in the same way. But if they are reaching difficulty getting those diagnoses, don't wait around for them and make the application request.
Does anyone else have any comments on this, or should we move on to the next question? Okay, Tania.
Okay. So what does the panel think about the inclusion or emphasis of alternative provision in what started as a SEND review? And as you will have noticed, that they are, constantly moving AP closer to SEND as if they go together, like peanut butter and jelly, when, they don't. What is your view of why that is happening, and that they seem to be using AP as a first stop instead of diagnosing or instead of assessing a child to see what their issues are?
Well, the reason that it's been done that way, it says in terms in the plan, is because the vast majority of kids in AP have SEND. The interesting question, I don't think the plan does answer, is should that be the case? And it is striking, isn't it, that the AP system is now part of the SEND system, or they are one system.
Well, they want it to be, yeah.
Well, that's the agenda. It's entirely clear from the plan.
Well, what they're talking about with three levels of AP, the outreach, short-term and long-term, that nowhere in there does it say if a child is having difficulties, we should find out what those difficulties are by an assessment. It doesn't say that. So it seems that it's all behavior, and getting moved. Does anybody else, Sharon, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think again, we need to look at the bigger picture and what else is happening in terms of education policy. And I can't remember if it's in the improvement plan or whether it was in the consultation analysis, because I've been reading both today. But one of them basically said that the overall intention is that there's going to be these groups of schools. So within a group, you will have mainstream schools, a special school, and probably AP provision. And I think the real danger here is that pupils will start to be assigned to a group of schools, and then it's going to become easier to start just moving surreptitiously almost pupils into different parts of the group of schools. I know from the research that I've been undertaking with parents, one of the parents that I was talking to, there was a sort of provision that was attached to the mainstream school her child was in, and they were actually putting him in that provision without her knowledge or permission. She actually just found out because she saw him going in there one day. And I think that we have a real danger that we have these groups of, as I say, mainstream provision, specialist provision, and some alternative provision, and it's going to be used as, again, almost a way to stop, as you said, those assessments happening, and again maybe reducing the number of EHCP assessments as well. Especially if people don't necessarily know what's happening behind the scenes.
And also, I guess if those schools are in a group, it would be very easy to say, well, the child has to fit into one of these provisions, rather than actually looking more widely and saying, well, what, where can best meet that child's needs?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else?
Renata, do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, okay, so the next question is actually two questions kind of grouped together. So the first part of it is, are they still talking about using panels to make local authority decisions? And if so, how can parents see how these panels come to the decisions they do? And the second question is about whether or not a parent should be able to receive a copy of the local authority's policy and procedure for Section 17 children in need assessments, and also policies and procedures around declining EHCP needs assessments, etc. Does anyone want to tackle that one first? Matt, have you got a view?
Yes, I was just looking at the text. Yeah, there is a proposal to it says introduce multi-agency panels, but every LA I know of already has them. Shall I read this out? Yeah, it'll be fun, won't it? The panels could help to ensure families are offered services going beyond signposting and helping families to navigate the system across education, health, including mental health, and care. Offering the right services at this early stage will help to reduce escalation of need and reassure parents that their child is being effectively supported, which sounds like any panel anyone has ever encountered in this area. It doesn't to me, I have to say.
Sounds like the IASSN. It sounds like a completely different function.
Yeah, I mean, how that, you know, would interact with current law. I mean, essentially, it's unclear. They're going to develop and test a standard for multi-agency advisory panels. There aren't any obvious requirements around what gets published, what right of correction, what inputs individual parent carers would have into that process.
So potentially they won't be any more transparent than they are at the moment.
No, I can't see any. I mean, there was a proposal. I'm not sure that's made it through. That if multi-agency panels would also potentially be involved in redress mechanisms. That was part of the green paper. I'm not sure that's made it through, but it's, you know, it's old wine in barely new bottles, that, isn't it, at a practical level?
And the other part of the question about policies for things like children in need assessments and declining HCP needs assessments. Should that be something that people can ask the local authority to provide?
Yeah, I'm happy to help with that, Renata. Yes, in short. They're all local authorities, of course, are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, and their policies should be publicly available. And in terms of thresholds for children's social care, there's a requirement to publish those in the Working Together to Safeguard Children statutory guidance, which is the key guidance document on that area, and people need to look at that if they're concerned about children's social care issues. So yes, in short, lawyers, of course, would get those things disclosed in pre-action correspondence if you were to threaten judicial review, but you shouldn't have to go that far to just get hold of policies that your local authority, as Sir James Mumby very famously said once, the local authority is the servant, not the master. It's their job to serve the community, and that includes letting the community know what policies they're operating.
Anyone else want to jump in on this one before we move on to the next? Actually, we're coming to our end of our time, so there'll probably be enough time for one more question.
Well, I actually would like to say there is a lot in there about ordinarily available provision, which means basically what you can expect your child to be able to get hold of without any HCP. What should parents be looking for in those policies when they start, you know, coming more to the fore? Hayley.
I think this is an important point, isn't it? And this is what Steve's touched upon as well. This is what the national standards is seeking to obtain, what's going to ordinarily be available in all of these schools. And we don't know that yet. And that's what they're going to be trialling and testing as part of the improvement plan, because there isn't a neatly defined list of what is available. Obviously, all local authorities should be putting on their websites their local offer. So some of this stuff that we do already have, but there isn't a neatly defined list of what should be available. And that's why the bar is low for any HC needs assessment ultimately, because we have to establish on individual needs what's available. And we look at across the board what would ordinarily be available in a mainstream school. And that can be obtained through different means, through freedom of information requests to different local authority areas about what's available in mainstream schools, what support is available at SEND support level, etc. It's not, unfortunately, a quick answer, but I think that the national standards wouldn't be coming they wouldn't be trying to push them through if they weren't going to try and change entitlement, because like Steve touched on earlier, by bringing that national level up, that would naturally reduce the amount that they're trying to push through to EHC plans. And we know that that is a real concern for lawyers and also for parents amongst us. So we really want to watch that as that goes through. It's a key point for the lawyers, particularly to see what they would be, who creates them, where they come from, because there's lots of talk, as we've mentioned many times in this improvement plan, how parents are at the fore of this, children and young people are at the fore. But I don't think children and parents and young people are going to be at the heart of determining what will ordinarily be available in a mainstream provision, because it would look very different and cost a lot more, I would imagine, than they want to spend.
Okay, I think that was the last of the questions.
Thank
So-
you everyone for the brilliant questions that you've sent in. I mean, luckily the panel have done a brilliant job of answering them as well. They've been beavering away answering the questions. And we've now just got one more last poll. We want to know how things are after you've listened to our expert panel. So our first question is, has this webinar helped you understand the plan and its implications better? And our second question is, having had some explanation, do you now think it will change SEND for the better? So I just give you a quick minute to answer that.
And the third question there at the bottom there, since the publication, are you more optimistic about the future of SEND? So as people are voting, we would just like to say thank you so much to Hayley, to Matt, to Sharon and to Steve for being so fantastic, so generous with your time. Let's just quickly end this poll before we run out of time. Let's see. Renata?
So we've got, so has this webinar helped you understand the plan and its implications better? We've got yes, a lot more, which is brilliant to hear. That's 60%, and yes, somewhat, that's 38%. No one said no. Thank you very much. And 2% of people said, I already knew everything I heard. So we are welcome anyway. Yeah, other experts. So our second question, having had some explanation, sorry, and let's just jump down. Yeah, having had some explanation, do you now think it will change SEND for the better? Unfortunately, 70% said not at all, 28% said some bits may, some bits won't, and we had 2% at I don't know, and
Sorry,
no, yes, a lot.
We will include those when we put the recording out, which we'll hopefully be doing very, very soon. Again, thank you to our guests and also to our excellent helper behind the scenes. If you've got any questions about the webinar or comments, when you get the email after this, there is a link there. And also, if you would like to make a donation to help our costs, that would be fantastic. So just sharing this, and thank you very much, and good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Team SNJ.